Hello, this is the Steven Hour, and we are back with a brand new video. It's been a long time since I done one, and today, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be doing a full TV show review, episode by episode by episode review, just like I did with the old Adam West Batman show and the Green Hornet show. And today, I am choosing the 1968 series that ran for 2 seasons, and that is Crime Story. Now, why am I choosing to do this series over instead of doing another old superhero show? Well, believe it or not, I was planning to do The Lone Ranger, but my heart wasn't in it, and I wanted to do Zorro, but I couldn't get it on Disney Plus out here in Australia yet. And interesting to do a show. I remember I was recently watching Crime Story recently, and I absolutely love the series. I just watched the whole series, and I decided, well, this could be a good way to make up for that. So, with that very brief thing out of the way, let's get into the series. Now, Crime Story is an American crime drama created by Chuck Adamson, Gustav Ringner. I'm probably butchering the last name. Those who created the show. It was produced by Michael Mann, who basically has this big production thing, and he does all of it. Now, the show originally aired on NBC, and the series basically is set in early 1960s Chicago, and it depicts a police officer, a Lieutenant Mike Torello, portrayed by Dennis Farina, who is chasing a mobster by the name of Ray Luca, portrayed by Anthony Denson. And basically, it is a cops and robbers type show with who's going to catch whom first. This show should be noted as responsible, really, for, I say, being Dennis Farina's really big breakout role. I mean, I'm sure he had other things before this, but for me, this is what I think was his real main breakthrough. The series was basically was one of the first series of its time to have overarching storylines, which was very rare at the time for crime shows, because that wasn't really the case. That type of television didn't really come out until the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, you had soap operas, but that was definitely drastically a completely different product. So anyway, that's a bit of the oversight. That's a bit of its history. And so let's get into the very first episode. Now, before we go in, I need to point out the pilot is essentially a two-part episode. So this is probably going to be one of the more longest episode reviews of any show I've done today, and it's obviously going to take into account for that. Anyway, with the background out of the way, let's actually get into reviewing the episode. Anyway, we begin Crime Story with basically Torello and some of his guys basically at a diner in a car, just waiting, for a call-in, basically having a bit of a break. Whilst that happens, the song Runaway plays. Now, this will become the show's main theme song throughout the show's run. The song Runaway was actually recorded in the early 60s by Del Shannon. For the show, it was re-recorded and done a bit differently. I freaking love this song, specifically the Crime Story version that Del Shannon basically helped re-record and rewrite. There's a specific lyric that's changed, but for me, this is my favorite rendition of the song. Anyway, while this is happening, the team gets a call that there's an armed robbery in progress. They quickly get in the car and drive off, with the Crime Story still being played. Now, this is what the show always did. They always tend to play songs that were appropriate for the times to give this series a lot of authenticity. I will be pointing some out both in this episode and in the ones to follow, at least the ones that I'm very familiar with, just to show the show's authenticity. Anyway, we then cut, just as the team are running over there, we cut to see the armed robbery in progress at a restaurant, where one of the armed robbers, Maz, gets too, on edge and ends up shooting a patron. Anyway, as the strike force soon approaches towards them, we see that at the outside the restaurant there is Paulie listening to a radio, and obviously for the police. When they hear they're coming, Paulie can't wait and begins to leave. Just as he leaves, the other guys start coming out of the restaurant, but it's too late. The cops are there, so they quickly get back in. There's then a sort of standoff with the robbers inside guarding the place, having the hostages, and basically the police and the strike force from MCU, the Major Crimes Unit, all surrounding the place, and your classic hostage negotiation takes place. Here we see Captain Mike Torello take full advantage. Both full advantage, but really asserts himself as the guy in charge, and basically manages to calm down, the whole situation that is happening, resulting in, that the robbers' demands are met. They're given a car and, are allowed to leave. But Mike Torello warns them that if anything should happen, he will kill the things that is most valuable to them. The mother, the father, the dog, dead. This is what I love about Mike Torello. He's a guy that will stand his ground, and again, because Dennis Farina has a history of being a real-life cop before he turned acting, again, gives us a bit of authenticity and realism to the performance here. I'm pretty sure he's putting his own real-life experience into this role. Anyway, just as they leave, Mike Torello is not willing to have them leave, despite having a bunch of hostages in their car. So he and the members of his strike force get into their cars and starts chasing. We then hear music play. Now this is, I'm pretty sure, is not music that was taken from the Times, but was, scores that were specific for the show. And for me personally, what I love about it, despite its, this song somehow manages to blend being something you can hear of the 80s, but at the same time, something that could be prevalent of the early 60s. Again, giving the series this authenticity vibe. And again, really liking it. The car chase is pretty good. Pretty good, and definitely also realistic to how car chases would be if it was in this time period. Anyway, but Mike Torello's car does catch up with them, and they result in forcing the car off the road into a suburban area. The armed robbers then quickly begin to leave the car, and the officers go to check on the hostages, whilst at the same time, Torello and some of them end up chasing some of the armed robbers, resulting in a shootout, killing basically all three. This scene then ends, but is capped off when Torello goes over to these kids who are watching through a window and basically, tells them politely to go away, showing his almost human side quality, as it were. Anyway, so that is really great. It got me interested and captivated. And then it goes to showing the opening credits with Runaway being played again. Obviously, you can show it's a little bit dated with some of their techniques, like all these old shows tend to be, but I never found it that, problematic. But anyway, we cut back to Torello and his guys doing what you usually expect in these crime shows, at the crime scene with the dead bodies, and basically Torello wants to know who are these guys and whose crew are they running with. However, one of his cops is a bit on edge. This police officer's name in question is Wes Connolly, portrayed by William Russ. Now, I know this actor from a lot of things. He appeared as a recurring character in the series Wise Guy, but I'm sure people best remember him as Mr. Matthews on the sitcom Boy Meets World, arguably his most recognizable and probably most infamous role. So it's weird seeing him in this when I saw him the first time. Basically, he's going a little bit crazy, a little bit off his rocker. Well, not so much off his rocker, but he's definitely got a bit of PTSD. Anyway, but Torello tells him to go cool off. They get word that one of the guys was killed. One of the armed robbers was Indian. And they basically have to follow through the chain of command. Basically follow the evidence to find out exactly where he is, contacts, you name it. Anyway, this is then followed by Torello going to a local bar where he meets a girl named Julie. They hit it off, and it's basically hinted through and basically they get married pretty quick. I really get this kind of love story they go for, and it feels a bit rushed, or if it was just something that was meant to imply that it was a flashback. I'm not entirely sure, but for me, as much as that's a gripe, I take that more criticism with with maybe the writing or some editing because of the time period this came out. Because old shows do tend to be dated, but I just get chalk it up to that. Anyway, they're in bed, and we get like some noises hinting of wartime. As we'll later find out, Mike Torello served in the Korean War and definitely would have a bit of PTSD from his time serving, as I'm sure many soldiers would. Anyway, that is then followed by Torello, getting up and going to see the O'Donnells, a local, a local couple in his neighborhood of the Patch. Mike Torello grew up here. Now, for those who don't know what the Patch is, for me as a mob enthusiasm dude, the Patch was a section in Chicago where basically some of the most notorious gangsters came out of here. Mad Sam DeStefano, Sam Mumu Giancana, and the already mentioned and Tony the Ant Spilotro. And this is just some of them, and that's just the ones that are known. Sure, there are others, but they are essentially what you call your basics. Anyway, whilst he's there, he meets their son Johnny, who it's definitely implied that Torello has definitely is definitely very friendly with them, and basically I would consider that he considers them pretty much family. And well, he's trying, and basically Johnny's saying how he's gone legit. He's finally getting out of the life, the small time crime game, and it's basically moving forward. Torello's loving this, and he and Julie, drive off, basically heading off to, for Torello heading off to work. This scene is then followed by outside what a classic traditional mob place, a social club where traditional mafiosos usually hung out. Here we are introduced to the series' main antagonist, Ray Luca, and Paul is basically telling him how the job went down, pretty bad. How the job went down, and basically Paul is trying to excuse his failures, basically by saying he held out for as long as he could. But Ray Luca not only doesn't buy it, he more blames Johnny for, not Johnny, sorry, Paulie for how things went down. As Ray says, you told me to hire the Indian. Now 2 guys I can trust are dead. This is all on you. And we also get another characteristic from Ray Luca, how he tends to, lash out violently. This scene is then interrupted as soon as Johnny enters. And it's clear that Ray and Johnny do go back a bit. And, it's clear that, Ray really does like Johnny. I like to think he probably considers him a younger brother type. But young brother type figure. And Johnny, despite telling, Mike Torello he's out of the life, the truth is he loves the Flash and wants to be a very respected guy in Chicago. But Ray Luca already has a well-known street cred reputation, so he goes to Ray to help him out with the jewelry heist at a local tough place. Ray is not only on board, but Johnny reveals why he went to Ray. Despite him having a crew, he needs some guys with experience. And basically, it's just this large jewelry heist. And Ray is on board seeing a cup. We then go to see Mike Torello at his work, along with his chief, boss type figure. And basically, it's revealing, how they are pretty much a bit undermanned and overworked, and basically they need to see results. And this is just another case that's just landed on Torello's desk. But, Torello is a professional. He and his number 2 guy go to a nearby watering hole to find where, this wild bird guy came from, the Indian that was killed in the robbery, and they ask around with the bartender. The bartender then reveals, he was often seen with some pals, and he could barely remember, who this guy was often seen with, until they eventually reveal who it is. Paulie Taglia. Now, lines earlier in the episode reveal that Paulie, already has a burglary beef with Mike Torello from MCU, and that was part of the reasons why he immediately bolted from the robbery when he heard that Mike Torello's MCU squad was on site, obviously not wanting to get caught. Then we see what Torello and his crew normally do. They go and rough up Paulie. This was something that become pretty prevalent, or sometimes even more violent as the series went on, to basically get information. Now, this might seem as police brutality, but you gotta understand, this was in the 60s, and a lot of these Miranda rights and all this shtick really didn't come that quite well into effect, and a lot of these more beat street cops didn't. Anyway, Torello takes Paulie to basically interrogate him and find more out on what he's up to. While that's happening, his second in command is going through Paulie's stuff. Obviously, Paulie doesn't know, because basically Paulie's a bit of an imbecile and finds a few names, addresses, you name it. Anyway, we go back to, main MCU headquarters, where, Torello and the guys are all going through Paulie's files, and they find out another guy that Paulie was known to work with. In fact, did a brief stint there in jail with a guy named Frank Holman, another top guy in Ray Luca's crew. We then cut to the scene where Ray, Johnny, Frank Holman, and Paulie are pulling off their big heist, resulting in millions of diamonds being stolen. The heist is successful, and I believe, if you can hear very carefully, the song in the background is, I'm pretty sure, an instrumental version of the Bo Diddley beat. And I really like, and again, adds authenticity to the show. Anyway, with the heist a success, Ray, Luca, and Johnny go to see Phil Bartoli, aka the boss. And basically, they need someone to fence this stuff. And Ray, Luke, and they both go to him. However, it's clear that Bartoli is trying to stiff them. I'm not sure exactly who Bartoli is supposed to be based off of. I heard that it might be Tony Accardo, aka Joe Batters, but I don't think so. And I don't think it's necessarily guys like Paul the Way to Rika or Sam Mumu Gincana. He's basically meant to, but he also, honestly, he kind of reminds me of a maybe a Joe Profaci type, or even a Joe Massaria type, a guy that's stiff and very unflattering to young punks, despite him being portrayed predominantly by John Pilati here. Anyway, after he's trying to stiff him, Johnny's getting a bit too hot-headed and leaves. Ray goes out and, convinces him to calm down and let him handle it. Ray then, goes to Phil Bartoli, and basically they do strike a better deal where, if he agrees to pay an amount up front and pay the rest when convenient in exchange for a continued merge of influx. It already should be noted that Ray has a reputation, but he's not necessarily what you call a made guy in the Chicago outfit. In fact, on the contrary, he and Johnny are independents. They have what the mob calls no sponsors, as it were. But, they have a job to do, and they intend... But anyway, Ray gets a better deal, and it goes for better for everyone. Anyway, Detective Connolly is following Frank Holman. This is a scene that kind of portrays both after the Ray, Luca, and Bartoli meeting. This scene kind of takes place because it's meant to show off something that's going to happen with his character as he's following Frank Holman, obviously to get evidence on Paulie and possibly Ray Luca. As Ray Luca, by this point, is starting to get on their radar. Anyway, Mike Torello is in court, as Paulie is there, obviously, for the burglary beef that was mentioned earlier in the episode. His defense attorney is Abrams, and he's definitely another series lead that's going to become quite prevalent. I'll probably talk a bit more about him in the casting, and I'll try not to repeat myself. And I see Abrams here as a very confident and very professional defense attorney. During this thing, I was saying how they got a informant to give up Paulie. Abrams reveals a wiretap and is implying that it was illegally planted there by Mike Torello. Mike Torello then goes and says it's not one of theirs, it's probably by, the FBI, as there are street rumors that Paulie might be tied with the KGB. And Abrams doesn't buy it for a minute, but Torello says it's just street rumor. We don't know if it's 100% true, but given the FBI's unethical behavior. Anyway, Abrams then loses his cool and basically gets, basically in trouble in court. And already, Abrams and Torello don't have exactly the best relationship, despite what they would get surprisingly later on in the series. Anyway, as they go to the elevator, They have some back and forth banter. And, Torello doesn't like Abrams because he's defending guys like, well, Paulie. Well, Abrams doesn't like Torello because he has your classic appearance and has the aura, despite being your traditional film noir cop, despite being arguably one of the best cops. Anyway, the scene ends there to a local bar where Ray Luca goes to pay Johnny his cut of the recent heist. But Johnny is, not happy, and he's clearly got some plans. Anyway, we see Connolly still follow Frank Holman, then Ray Luca. Well, actually Ray Luca, but loses him but goes to a nearby phone booth, which a call about his progress. Only for Ray Luca to surprisingly come out of nowhere just as Connolly is on the phone and ends up shooting him. I love the scene, and I love the build-up, and I really love the score that adds to it. The next scene is obviously Torello mourning the death of a fellow colleague and friend, and he begins to imagine things he's saying as if he was still in the room. It's then raining, and he is out there, goes to his place where he died, and mourns his death, and he gets angry when he sees the bullet holes in the phone booth and ends up smashing it and collapses down crying. This shows Farina's incredible acting range, and I could really think that he's being authentic here, as I'm sure he would have probably witnessed a lot in his life, fellow officers dying on the line of duty. And what really makes this scene arguably so great already is the musical score. They got an actual song from the early time period, Stand By Me by B.E. King, which for me just makes this scene work phenomenally well and shows his pain. The next scene is a robbery with Johnny and two of his guys that he does the scores with, that ends up robbing Phil Bartoli's place, and the other guys are angry at him because now that they say, he's gonna come after them. But Johnny is a classic cocky guy, and it's going to catch up with him. You could tell guys like this in shows. The next scene is Ray Luca at a restaurant with his wife having dinner, celebrating, I believe it's either an anniversary or just trying to have couples out. You can clearly tell there's a bit of tension in their relationship, despite obviously love there. And it's a classic what wise guys tend to have with being married and all that. Anyway, Phil Bartoli arrives and basically is hinting that it's time for Ray Luca to rise up further in the ranks, and he also lets slip that his place has recently been robbed, and basically implies that he's ordering a contract hit out of the guys who did it, and Ray immediately knows who it is. Ray and another partner and Frank Holman go to a nearby diner and end up killing two of Johnny's guys. Luke and Torello comes there to witness the aftermath, after witnessing the waitress saying how this was clearly an execution, a classic hit. Who are they normally seen with? They're seen with Johnny. Torello then realized Johnny never really got out of the game and is still in. He then goes to the patch and ends up interrogating him. Johnny acts first ignorant to what Torello is saying, but then when Torello starts revealing everything, he acts all cocky, how he's a tough guy and he's the best guy in all of Chicago. Torello, however, basically tells him, this is going to end badly for your kid, no matter what you do. Anyway, but Torello and his number 2 guy, they can't arrest him courtesy of, well, there's no evidence. So they have no choice but to let him go. Another scene is with Abrams at a nearby pub. Well, bar, I should say. Well, I don't know why I keep saying pub, probably because I'm Australian. And, we don't say bars, we say pubs here. At least majority of the time. And Abrams meets an old college friend, and the college friend introduces him to a friend of his, Ray Luca. The two kind of do have a slight hitting it off, despite Abrams not really being that fond of him. Anyway, we go back to Mike Torello's apartment where he and Julie are getting ready to go to a member of his family's wedding, until he gets a call that the O'Donnellys had just been attacked. He and Julie immediately go over there, and the O'Donnellys revealed that they weren't after them, they were after Johnny. Realizing that this has to be a hit from the higher up, Torello and his team basically kidnap Phil Bartoli and take him to a nearby water tower, tiring up and saying that anything happens to Johnny, he's dead. Anyway, this then ends with, obviously Torello has to get back to his family's wedding, where he gets there, only to see his wife dancing with some guy on the floor, and this is where we see a bit of his insecurities come into play, and he's thinking that a guy is hitting on her and that she's really going along with it. I could see why, because it's clear that Torella is a bit older, and a lot of cop shows now have with an older character, especially think about characters like Gibbs from NCIS, or Rossi from Criminal Minds, or even Tom Selleck's character Frank Reagan from NYPD, wait, not NYPD Blues, sorry, Blue Bloods. You know, they're the older guys, but they surprisingly attract young women, obviously that are meant to be more mature and are mature. They're like what, in their 30s, approaching 40, so you get that kind of more closer in age gap. But it's clear that has a bit of a jealousy and insecurity because his wife is clearly a bit younger. Anyway, he drowns his sorrows at a nearby bar, and he does kind of hit on a girl-ish, about to make out, but I think he stops himself. Partly because it doesn't feel right, and he just doesn't want to. Anyway, he returns back to their apartment, where Julie's there. He's slightly drunk and reveals what he saw, but Julie then reveals that the guy who was dancing was his cousin Andy. Torello is taken aback because he remembers Andy when he was just a little kid, and he can't believe that's the case, but he reveals that he's actually my age, 23, and that at that age, any guy would hit on anything. Torello then feels guilty, though he does slightly defend himself what he saw, but he does admit a bit of his shortcomings. So you can't kind of say he's putting the full blame on her, he's taking some of the blame, but he also admits that um, why he did it. I'm pretty sure he's not justifying it 100%, but he's definitely revealing his side of things. The scene ends with them essentially making out. This is then followed by, basically followed with Johnny and Ray going up to pick up what's left of the diamonds, some diamonds, their cash and all that. And Ray wants to basically drive Johnny's car. One of the things I always loved about the show is the cars. They look fantastical. Anyway, the scene then ends with Ray ultimately performing the hit on Johnny. Obviously not getting the call from Phil Bartoli that the contract was off. Another scene is then followed with him at his home, basically cooking up this meat where all these diamonds are in. His wife comes out and he does start yell and begins to get angry at her. This will again become another thing that become quite prevalent with Ray Luca and his wife dynamic. Kind of, in many ways, kind of a parallel with Mike Torello and his wife, as they too will have problems. Obviously, not as violent and dangerous as this. They go to the hospital where they see Johnny, in intensive care and basically on the verge of death. The sergeant comes in and Mike Torello's number 2 comes in, aka which is Sergeant, and reveals some info of an upcoming heist that's about to take place. It's then Johnny's funeral, where everyone's in attendance, including Mike Torello, to pay his respects. He gets angry when he sees a flower that was delivered by Ray Luca and his wife. Despite, I'm pretty sure, him killing Johnny, I like to think that deep down Ray always regretted it. And wished that it could have been prevented. And this is a kind of what you expect, really, in these gangland circles. When funerals happen, it brings a community together, and especially many from the patch. We'll also see Abrams come here with his father. I'm pretty sure it's portrayed by a different actor than what the actor would be later on down Okay, let's have a talk about the cast for this series. First off, our arguably main lead is, of course, Lieutenant Mike Torello, portrayed by the late Dennis Farina. And he basically, for me, is, first off, this guy was already a cop in real life before he turned to acting. So he brings a bit of authenticity to the role of what it's like to play a cop. Obviously, they take great liberties because it is a TV show, and honestly, he definitely has the image of those old school cops. Really, I would say from the 40s, even into the early 60s, like the way he dresses, the way he acts. He screams old school cop. So I really like that. Our other great lead that we get in the series is, of course, Ray Luca, portrayed by Anthony Dennison. And for me, I've always loved the look of Ray Luca, and he does his inspiration does come from actual real life gangsters, particularly Tony the Ant Spilotro, the real life uh, gangster made within the Chicago outfit, and of course he was the character that Joe Pesci, and of course the character is based off the Ant. Ray Luca is based off the Ant, but also was the but was also but was also in Casino. That the character Joe Pesci played was based off the real life guy, and again, I just love his performance here. How he looks like a tough guy, but all like the way he bursts into outbursts, you really tell that this guy is one of your classic definitions of a loose cannon. Another great addition to the cast of mainstay is, of course, David Abrams, played by Stephen Lang, a guy with a phenomenal film and television career. This was one of his first early roles, and of course, like I said in the review, he plays a lawyer, but specifically a defense lawyer. And I like how at first he and Mike Torello get along, and how his relationship with Ray Luca is. Like, he's definitely an independent guy. He has a background of being connected with the mob because of his old man, but he doesn't want to go in that direction. He became a defense attorney to defend those who couldn't have a voice for themselves. So I really like that, and really appreciate that, if I could be all in good honesty. Another lead that the show gave us is the character of Paul Taglia, portrayed by John Stenucci. A very colorful guy before he became an actor. He was actually a thief. In fact, according to a rumor, I'm not 100% sure if it's confirmed, but when he was arrested, one of the arresting officers who arrested him was Dennis Farina. And basically, Paul Taglia is Ray Luca's sidekick, number two guy. A bit of a bumbling goof, but a guy to not be messed around with, as we'll find out later on. He's kind of like reminds me of a proto Bobby Buckley-Ecker from The Sopranos, but he's a guy not to be messed around with, basically, and I think we can all agree to that. Also, the rest of his cast includes the members of Mike Torello's Strike Force team. His second in command is a Danny Kretchen, portrayed by Bill Schmidt-Truff. And as we find out, he has a bit of a Russian background. And basically, he's his number two guy, the guy that's basically his second in command. Other members of the team include Detective Joey Idell, Detective Walter Clemens, and Detective Nat Grossman, all portrayed by actors Bill Campbell, Paul Butler, Steve Ryan, and basically they're this knit group, and each have a kind of personality type that we'll find out later on. But we can really get already by the pilot that there is this sort of camaraderie. There is a thing that ties them all together, and nothing can really break that. And I can't wait to see where we find more with these characters. So already made an impression, all of these, and I can't wait to explore more. Surprisingly, season 1 also established some reoccurring characters, some that become quite prevalent really in the series. Let's talk about, I think, the most prevalent one. Manny Manny Weisbrod, portrayed by Joseph Wiseman. I, for the love of me, have seen this show many times, but it's only took me until a very recent watching to realize that this is the same actor who portrayed Dr. Julius Snow in Doctor No. And, and for me, he's he's basically a mentor to Ray Luca, and he's basically portrayed to be more of a Meyer Lansky type, and is definitely has a large organization, and has definitely had a lot of ties with the Chicago outfit. Another sort of mentor and a guy that made numerous appearances really throughout the first season is Phil Bartoli. Another mentor to Ray, and is kind of the real true boss of the Chicago outfit, portrayed by John Piloto. Again, a phenomenal actor. I've seen him in a lot of wise guy gangster roles and some definitely voiceover work. His last voiceover work was as Hammerhead in the Ultimate Spider-Man TV show just before he passed, and then of course he played the corrupt Gillian Loeb in Batman Year One, a animated Batman movie that was adapting the comic of the same name. I, however, best remember him from a guest appearance in Castle, where the episode was him being the episode was about a murder of a recent old school mob don, and they kind of took blast from the past, so it's a lot of love letters to the 70s. I feel he did a great role as playing Harold, who is basically the two were long close, and it's revealed that he's gay. For me, this showcases his strengths of being a tough guy, but also his strengths of an actor to also be vulnerable, and I think it was one of his best performances, in all honesty. Another character that became very prominent throughout the series is Frank Homan, portrayed by Ted Levin, and is basically another one of Ray Luca's men, and apart from Paulie, probably his another most prominent one. Something that we were going to see, of course, later on in the series. Another character that became prevalent in season 1 is Julie Torello, portrayed by the actress Darlene Falugil. Probably butchering her name, but not intended. Basically, she is Torello's wife, and and like I said, she's prominent really in the first of season 1. Obviously, we can hint where her character will be going from here. And basically, I'll be honest, out of all the female actresses with Mike Torello, obviously they have, I think, the best chemistry. I also want to give a shout out to the special guest cameo that we get here, and that is, of course, of Johnny O'Donnell, a young punk wannabe gangster and a huge friend of Ray Luca, and he's portrayed by David Caruso, who of course is an actor with a long history resume. He was in NYPD Blue, and I think it was CSI Miami, and this was, I think, one of his first acting roles, and he's arguably the true guest star of this episode. And again, there'll be more guest stars appearing throughout the series, and I can't wait, when we get to explain and explore them a bit better. So far, this is a very strong pilot. It set up the premise of the show, it set up our main leads of, Mike Torello and Ray Luca, their characters, their dynamics, and their basically goals and driving force is really great. It's complemented, of course, with the background of the early 1960s, a time period I really like because it's had the remnants of the old rock and roll of the 50s before it transitioned to what you would synonymously recognize with the whole decade. The early 60s was drastically different to really the mid to late 60s. So there's definitely a distinctive, not so much vibe, but just tone. I also love the production design. Like, you gotta understand, this show was made in the 80s, really well. 80s, and you would imagine that trying to do a period piece obviously would be a very expensive budget, but for the most part they pull it off. The musical scores using actual songs from the time period, both in the early 60s and as we go later in the show, some songs that kind of came out in the a little bit of the late 50s, really helps drive this authenticity feel. It definitely reminds me a lot of Martin Scorsese movies, and definitely Mafia 3. It's if you ever played that game. And what I really like about this, just overall, it sets not only to set up the premise, everything, but it just really got me hooked in. If this pilot wasn't as well done, I highly doubt I would watch it. I would have bothered watching. So it was a really good, strong pilot. And so far, the series is starting off strong in my book. And there we have it. That was the pilot for Crime Story. Join us next time when we review the second episode in the series. Until then, this has been the Stephen Out, ladies and gentlemen. So long for now.